Organisational change is all around us. What we really need to make sure of is that we support individuals to understand, accept, and adopt changes. Even ISO 55000 as one of the outcomes in 2024 was the inclusion of both adaptability and sustainability, which really goes to the heart and soul of change. You want to use structured approaches, looking at change readiness, assessing that, how we communicate, engage, train, and of course, coach people. We want to address resistance in a positive manner and reinforce those desired behaviours. And again, this is both top down, bottom up, and across the organisation. We often say change management top down, the management of change bottom up, as per asset management and the management of assets. But we also want to ensure that change is sustained so benefits are achieved and embedded, which brings us back as a reminder to sustainability as one of the outcomes under 55,000. It's one thing for someone to consider change as moving from point A to point B in an organisation. But what we really need to understand is the readiness for change. So the real risk here is staff aren't even prepared for the scale, the pace, or the enormity of the change ahead. And believe me, small change can also lead to a big impact in an organisation. So what we want to do is really look at conducting readiness assessments. And if you do that with the business, you can actually start to look at the different dimensions of impact in their world. You can then tie it back up to overarching risk categories, and all of a sudden you can adapt plans in and around organisational capacity and also organisational capability. This comes back to the old walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Good leadership sponsorship in and around organisational change is beyond paramount. It's a necessity. Leaders, or the risk here is that leaders endorse change in principle, they speak to it, but don't actively get involved and sponsor it. What we need to do is train, inform, and hold leaders accountable and visible for ongoing sponsorship. Because remember, change might be seeking to get an outcome, but it's equally important to measure, support, and sponsor the change journey itself. Because whilst the outcome might be important, you can disrupt the organisation in getting there, and that's not what we want. Communication, or the effectiveness of communication, is always a debate in many organisations. What happens in the boardroom, down to the CEO, to the C-suite, to the E-suite, and down through the organisation, it can sometimes lose its effectiveness or the key meaning behind the communication. So the risk here is, of course, messages are unclear, inconsistent, or not tailored to different audiences. I often say that the message is the why, the communication is the what, and the engagement is how. Those three things all factor into communication effectiveness. So again, as you can see, the why, the what, the how, and the when in messaging, and ensure, not just suggest it, but ensure that the message is actually clear for different stakeholders, whether they are internal or external, and seek feedback to make sure that they're one, hearing, but also understanding the message that was conveyed. When we look at resistance to change, I mean, it's all around us. As a change practitioner myself, I sometimes don't like to change. But the real risk here is employees actively or passively resist new ways of working. Now, I think one of the key causes of this, or contributors to this, is when people feel that the change is being done to them personally, as opposed to being done through the organisation, through to their role. That's a key insight for you. But if we can identify the different sources of resistance, get in early, engage in the messaging, the dialogue, and address concerns, which can really mean sometimes putting yourself out there in front of sometimes some very disenfranchised or angry stakeholders, you need to be able to do it. Because organisational change management is a different type of leadership, and you always need to be ready to take on that resistance, but not through a combative sense, but more through a collaborative sense. when we refer to organisational change management, we're obviously moving to something new in the hope that it's going to be innovative and provide more value. But the real risk here is that staff aren't given the knowledge or the tools to adapt to new ways of working, new processes, new technology, whatever it might be. We need to be able to understand what the potential gap or delta might be a better word, and provide targeted training, coaching, and hands-on learning. But when we're looking at training and capability building, the best way to start off with a training or a capability needs assessment, because that way then you can link the job description that the person's sitting in with the function that they're serving in the context of the organization, and it becomes then a discussion point and even perhaps a blueprint for that training and capability. It's one thing to change management activity, but it's another thing to sustain the change. And that's the momentum of the change journey itself, but also to the outcomes in which the change is seeking to achieve. So the risk here is change fade over time. People revert to old habits. This also ties back in with leadership sponsorship to the change, but also keeping the finger on the pulse as to the sentiment of how change is going and what it's meaning for individuals. So we can reinforce the sustainment of change through recognition. So, i.e., someone's role has been made easier due to the change, or there's been a win within the change journey itself. How do we integrate that both across the organization, but also into different performance systems and driving that continual improvement? And as a reminder, sustainability is the third outcome of asset management as per ISO 55000. If we think about organisational change management as it applies and aligns back with 55001, the first and foremost would definitely be section 5.1, leadership and commitment. The second element, and so pleasing that this has been in the ISO harmonised structure since 2020-21, is section 6.3, planning of changes, because you've got to understand what you're setting out to do, versus section 8.2, control of change, because both of those work hand in hand. So they're the three key areas. Of course, when we think about change, ISO 55001 is very much around a full decision-making framework and the assurance that goes with it, but these would be the three main sections that align with OCM. So in summary, organisational change management, also known as OCM, ensures people move from old ways of working to a new way successfully. So asset management improvements deliver value sustainably. And as I mentioned before, you go to ISO 55000, adaptability is to change, sustainability is maintaining that value from the change.